According to historians, the most faithful followers of Jesus were 12 ordinary men in a world that seemed reserved for the powerful. First-century Palestine did not offer many opportunities. It was under the iron rule of the Roman Empire. It was a territory divided by religious and political tensions, and most people survived through humble trades. In that setting, Jesus chose a group that had no prestige, titles, or power. Even so, their names, Simon Peter, Andrew, James the Greater, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James the Lesser, Jude Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, would be forever engraved in history, although in their time they were merely anonymous men surrounded by dust, fishing nets, rudimentary tools, and the daily uncertainty of life in Galilee. Peter, originally Simon, was a fisherman from Bethsaida and later a resident of Capernaum. His impulsive, direct, and vehement character made him a central figure from the beginning. Jesus renamed him Cephas, which in Aramaic means rock, anticipating the role he would play in the emerging community. His brother Andrew, also a fisherman, had a different temperament. He was thoughtful, attentive to details, and able to recognize opportunities where others saw nothing. According to the Gospel of John, he was a disciple of John the Baptist before following Jesus, which reveals an earlier spiritual inclination. James and John, sons of Zebedee, were fishermen with a family business stable enough to employ hired workers. Jesus nicknamed them Boanerges, sons of thunder, for their intensity and energy. James would later become the first of them to die for his faith, John the last to survive among the apostles. Both formed, along with Peter, an inner circle around the Master, present at key moments such as the Transfiguration and Gethsemane. Philip, also from Bethsaida, appears in the Gospels as someone practical and direct, capable of asking uncomfortable but necessary questions. His analytical personality contrasts with that of Bartholomew, traditionally identified with Nathanael, a man without deceit, described by Jesus as a true Israelite. Bartholomew was perhaps from Cana in Galilee, and his frank character would accompany him in his future missions according to tradition. Matthew, formerly called Levi, was a tax collector for Rome, an occupation despised by the Jewish people. This fact makes him one of the most unexpected profiles in the group. His life was marked by suspicion and social rejection, but his encounter with Jesus would radically change his path. Thomas, known for his skepticism, had a serious, introspective, and perhaps melancholic personality. The nickname Didymus twin suggests an identity he shared with some brother not identified in the accounts. James the Lesser, son of Alphaeus, is one of the most enigmatic figures. Some associate him with James, brother of the Lord, a significant figure in the early church and leader of the Jerusalem community. Although the identification is not unanimous, tradition presents him as austere, devout, and deeply respected by the Jews of his time. Jude Thaddeus, sometimes called simply Thaddeus or Labius, was probably a cousin of Jesus according to certain family traditions. His gentle yet firm character is reflected in his brief New Testament epistle. Simon the Zealot represents another unique profile. His designation suggests ties to Jewish nationalist movements that opposed Rome violently. Choosing a zealot and a tax collector to live together within the same group reveals Jesus' ability to unite men who were radically different. Lastly, Judas Iscariot, whose surname may refer to his place of origin, Keriot, or to an association with radical Sicarii groups, was the one in charge of the common purse. His accounting role indicates a certain level of initial trust placed in him. Jesus did not choose the 12 for their political, intellectual, or religious capabilities, but because each one embodied a human aspect that could be transformed into a tool for his mission. He did not choose experienced scribes nor aristocrats with influence in Jerusalem. He opted for peasants, fishermen, craftsmen, men without formal education, and a controversial figure like a tax collector. This contrast between their simplicity and the impact they would later have has been, for centuries, one of the most striking characteristics of early Christianity. Geography also played a crucial role. Galilee, birthplace of most of them, was a mixed region where traditionalist Jews, Hellenized Jews, and pagans lived together. Its cities, such as Capernaum and Bethsaida, were crossed by trade routes, which made it possible for these men to coexist with different cultures before their mission. Some historians suggest that this early exposure to diversity may have prepared them to take their message beyond the borders of Israel. Although not all were the same age, it is estimated that most were young adults, probably between 20 and 35 years old when they were called by Jesus. The traditional image of mature men is more recent. In reality, some may have been almost teenagers at the beginning of their discipleship. Their youth explains in part their ability to leave everything behind, embark on long journeys and face persecution. Despite their differences, there was an internal coherence among them. All sought something greater than their own lives. Some did so from deep spirituality, others from a desire for justice, others from frustration with the established order. Jesus saw in each one a spark sufficient to shape them into what they would later become, witnesses who would transform the history of the Eastern Mediterranean in barely 3 decades. Their humanity, marked by opposing temperaments, strengths, and weaknesses, defines their true identity. They were not perfect heroes, but ordinary men who would be pushed to the limit by events none of them imagined the day they first heard the invitation. Follow me. The calling of Jesus from anonymity to mission. The lives of the apostles before meeting Jesus were marked by routine and necessity. Peter, Andrew, James, and John lived from fishing on the Sea of Galilee, an unpredictable trade subject to the weather, Roman taxes, and daily competition. Matthew worked as a tax collector, confined to a tax booth surrounded by distrust and contempt. Thomas, Philip, and Bartholomew seem to have been involved in commercial or agricultural activities typical of the region. None of them imagined that a chance encounter would transform their existence and turn them into figures whose influence would reach the farthest corners of religious history. The calling of Jesus happens, according to the Gospels, in everyday settings: the shore of a lake, a dusty road, a tax booth. There were no grand speeches or formal ceremonies. The invitation was direct, simple, and disarming. Follow me. Each one interpreted those words from his own inner world. For some, it represented a break with a difficult past. For others, the beginning of a movement that, although mysterious, seemed to respond to the longing of a people seeking redemption under Roman rule. Peter and Andrew were the first to leave their nets. The narrative emphasizes their promptness. They left the boat immediately. That gesture symbolizes the eruption of something greater than any economic security. James and John, called shortly after, even left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired workers, an act that would have caused murmurs in a context where family was the most important social core. The decision of these young fishermen indicates not only devotion but also a sense of urgency before the figure of that itinerant teacher. Matthew's case is different. As a publican, his life was protected by Rome but rejected by his own people. Leaving that position meant giving up economic privileges and assuming the popular hatred for having served the oppressive system. However, his immediate response reveals a repressed desire to reintegrate into a community that perhaps never fully accepted him. The dinner he organized for Jesus, surrounded by other publicans and sinners according to the sources, marks a turning point. A man associated with corruption decides to join a spiritual project that demands renunciation and surrender. Thomas appears later in the accounts, but his introspective personality suggests that the calling was an internal process rather than a sudden moment. He likely followed Jesus, attracted by the authenticity of the group and the promise of a kingdom unlike any known political project. Philip, for his part, played a special role in inviting Bartholomew, telling him, "We have found the one Moses and the prophets wrote about." This chain of invitations shows that the mission began even before they fully understood whom they were following. The accounts agree that Jesus did not form a homogeneous group. Among the 12, there were fishermen, a tax collector, a possible revolutionary zealot, and men whose professions are not even mentioned, signs of their anonymity. The mixture was socially explosive. A tax collector sitting next to an anti-Roman nationalist would have been unthinkable without the presence of a figure capable of transcending those differences. It is precisely this diversity that shows that the calling was not directed at a particular social class, but to all who were willing to transform their lives from the deepest part of themselves. Leaving everything behind involved risk. The region was watched by Roman legions, controlled by Herod Antipas, and subjected to internal tensions among Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. Any popular movement could be considered subversive. Even so, the 12 walked with Jesus through villages and cities, listening to teachings that broke traditional religious frameworks. The emotional cost was also great. long absences from home, economic uncertainty, and the growing rejection from religious authorities who saw in Jesus a threat to their power. The progression of the calling also has a symbolic tone. Jesus first invites them to follow him, then to learn from him, and finally to send them out 2 by 2 to proclaim his message. The mission, which at first seemed like a spiritual adventure, took the shape of a public responsibility. Preaching, healing the sick, and casting out demons were actions that placed them in direct confrontation with the expectations of the people who saw in them an extension of their master's power. Their personal bond deepened over time. They lived together, ate together, and faced dangers and tensions that strengthened their identity as a group. The dynamics among them were marked by rivalries, such as the attempts of James and John to occupy places of honor, or Peter's impetuousness in wanting to lead without always understanding the meaning of the teachings. Yet this learning process, also marked by failures, shaped their character for the challenges that would come later. One of the most significant moments was when Jesus gathered them to officially appoint them as apostles, that is, as those who are sent. This act formalized their role and gave them authority to represent his message. The complete list appears in several Gospels, although with slight variations reflecting the early interest in preserving the names of those who would become pillars of the Christian community. From that moment on, each one's life became linked not only to Jesus, but to the destiny of a movement that would expand beyond anything imaginable. The calling was also a point of no return. As Jesus gained followers and enemies, the 12 realized that their choice would make them targets of persecution. After the crucifixion and resurrection, the mission would intensify to the ends of the Roman Empire, where many would face torture, exile, and death. But it all began in those first steps along dusty roads, when ordinary men left behind the little they had because they felt they were standing before something that would change the world. And that change would begin to become visible in the figure of the most impulsive among them, who would go from rough fisherman to martyr of Rome. Peter, from impulsive fisherman to crucified martyr in Rome. Simon Peter emerged from a background as humble as that of the other fishermen of the Sea of Galilee. His house in Capernaum near the synagogue shows that his family had a small economic foothold thanks to fishing, but nothing more than that. Life on the coast meant entire nights casting nets, repairing boats, and competing for an ever scarcer catch due to the taxes imposed by the tetrarch Herod Antipas and the Roman Empire. Peter grew up in that harsh environment, marked by physical labor and the need to make quick decisions, something that would define his bold and impulsive character. His encounter with Jesus transformed that temperament into a useful tool for the emerging movement. Peter was one of the first to be called and quickly became the voice of the group. The Gospels show him speaking where others remained silent, asking what no one dared to articulate, and acting with a mix of courage and clumsiness. When Jesus called him Kephas, rock, he was pointing to a mission Peter could not yet imagine. In his fiery personality lived two forces, a fierce loyalty and a deep vulnerability. Peter's leadership becomes evident in key moments. He was the first to publicly confess that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, but also the first to be severely rebuked when, not understanding the dimension of that mission, he tried to dissuade him from facing death. Peter wanted a strong political Messiah capable of liberating Israel. Jesus spoke to him of sacrifice and surrender. This inner tension would accompany him throughout his life. During the Last Supper, Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him, something Peter rejected indignantly. However, his impulsive nature led him to act before thinking. When the guards arrived at Gethsemane, he grabbed a sword and attacked the servant of the high priest, provoking a confrontation that Jesus stopped. That gesture marked the beginning of a heartbreaking internal process. Hours later, Peter would deny him 3 times before strangers, afraid of being arrested. His anguish is reflected in the phrase, "and he wept bitterly," one of the most human scenes in the New Testament. After the resurrection, the accounts present him as restored by Jesus through a dialogue in which he was asked 3 times whether he loved him, reflecting his 3 denials. From that moment on, Peter took an official role within the group, leading community decisions and preaching publicly in Jerusalem. In the book of Acts, he appears as a key figure in the initial expansion of Christianity. He heals the sick, confronts the Sanhedrin, visits new communities, and is the protagonist of the episode in which a Roman centurion, Cornelius, converts to Christianity, an event that opens the door to non-Jews. Tradition indicates that Peter later traveled to Antioch and finally to Rome, where his figure became a reference point for the Christian community of the imperial capital. Although the Bible does not narrate his death, early sources such as Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and later Tertullian and Origen affirm that he was martyred during the persecution of Nero, probably between the years 64 and 67 AD. This persecution arose after the fire of Rome, when the emperor needed scapegoats to appease the anger of the people. Peter's martyrdom is wrapped in symbolism. According to the most widespread tradition, he asked to be crucified upside down because he did not consider himself worthy of dying as his master did. The image of an old man, bent by age and persecutions, being led to the place of execution, possibly in Nero's circus near the Vatican, is one of the most dramatic moments of early Christian history. His body is believed to have been buried near the place of martyrdom, and from very early on the Christians of Rome venerated that site, where centuries later St. Peter's Basilica would be built. Archaeological evidence supports part of this tradition. Beneath the present basilica, remains of a first-century cemetery and a tomb venerated since very ancient times were found, with graffiti mentioning Peter. Although absolute identification is impossible, the collective memory of the Roman community seems to have preserved the apostles' memory without interruption. Peter's end reflects not only his personal transformation, but also the harshness with which the empire treated the first Christians. His path from the calm waters of the Sea of Galilee to the brutality of martyrdom in Rome embodies the transition from an ordinary fisherman to one of the pillars of a faith that would spread throughout the Mediterranean world. His story combines human weakness and iron determination, fear and courage, shame and redemption. The first followers remembered him as an imperfect but passionate leader, capable of rising after every fall. That trait would make him a model for later generations, not because of his perfection, but because of his humanity when confronted with a destiny he never could have imagined while casting nets on the shore of the lake. And from Rome, the story inevitably leads toward the disciple who, unlike Peter, lived long enough to witness how persecution became a permanent horizon for the nascent church. John, the beloved disciple, and his mysterious end in Ephesus. John, son of Zebedee and brother of James, emerged from the beginning as a singular figure among the 12. His family held a relatively stable position within the fishing trade of Galilee, which allowed them to employ hired workers and maintain a small business of their own. This economic base granted them a certain independence, but it did not remove them from the harsh reality of daily labor, with cold dawns, heavy nets, and the constant risk of losing the catch to tax collectors. From that simple and disciplined world came a young man of intense character, emotional and deeply loyal. Jesus called him a son of thunder together with his brother, a nickname that has puzzled generations of readers. It may refer to a fiery temperament, perhaps even impulsive, capable of reacting strongly to injustice. However, the John who appears in the Gospels, and especially in later tradition, gradually transforms into a serene spiritual leader, contemplative and focused on love. This evolution has been interpreted as a direct result of his closeness to Jesus, with whom he maintained a particularly deep relationship. John appears in the most intimate moments of the ministry, the transfiguration, the resurrection of the daughter of Jairus, and the agony in Gethsemane. He is also the only one of the 12 who, according to the Gospels, remained at the foot of the cross alongside Mary. That gesture of absolute loyalty amid widespread fear cemented his reputation as the beloved disciple. Jesus, in that scene, entrusted him with the care of his mother, a gesture that indicates both personal trust and recognition of his inner strength at a critical hour. After the resurrection, John took an active part in the leadership of the Jerusalem community alongside Peter. The book of Acts shows him accompanying Peter in acts of preaching and in defending the faith before the religious authorities. His constant presence suggests that he was respected not only for his special connection with the Master, but also for his ability to maintain cohesion at a time when the budding community faced persecutions and internal tensions. Tradition holds that John later moved to Ephesus, one of the most important cities of Asia Minor. There he would have served as leader of the local Christian communities, consolidating his pastoral role and spiritual influence. The region, dominated by Greco-Roman culture and the cult of Artemis, represented a significant challenge for Christian preaching. However, Accounts indicate that John managed to found and strengthen vigorous communities thanks to his reflective nature and his constant call to brotherly love. One of the most emblematic episodes of his later life is his exile on the island of Patmos during the reign of Emperor Domitian around the year 95 AD. According to tradition, it was there that he received the visions that would later be recorded in the Book of Revelation. Patmos was a harsh place of banishment with rocky hills and little vegetation, used to isolate figures considered dangerous to the imperial order. That John was sent there suggests that his preaching had a significant impact in the region. The Book of Revelation reflects a literary style different from that of the Gospel attributed to John, which has generated scholarly debates for centuries. However, patristic tradition attributes both works to the same figure, interpreting the differences as the result of personal circumstances, aging, and the distinct purpose of each text. What is certain is that the Book of Revelation, with its powerful imagery, its persecutions, and its hope in a redemptive future, fits the context of political and religious tension experienced in Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century. After his exile, John is said to have returned to Ephesus, where he died old, becoming the only one of the 12 apostles who did not suffer a violent martyrdom. Some traditions state that he lived to an advanced age, even surpassing 90 years at a time when life expectancy was considerably low. His tomb, located on the hill of Iasoluk, was venerated from very early on, and over it the Basilica of St. John was later built during the reign of Justinian in the 6th century. A curious detail of the Ephesian tradition is the belief that John did not truly die, but rather sleeps until the end of time. This idea is based on a literal interpretation of a passage from the Gospel of John and endured for centuries, fueling local legends. Medieval pilgrims claimed that a miraculous dust arose from his tomb, attributing healing properties to it. Though these accounts belong to the world of popular devotion, they show the extent to which his figure became shrouded in mystery. For the early Christians, John represented the living continuity of Jesus' message in a time of constant persecution. His longevity allowed a direct connection with the past and gave him the authority to transmit memories of the Master. The community granted him special prestige, the last eyewitness, the guardian of the original memory, the elder whose serenity testified to a life marked by faithfulness. The story of John, marked by a blend of youthful intensity, spiritual leadership, and an end wrapped in calm and mystery, contrasts deeply with the tragic fate of his brother James, who would be the first to lose his life because of the faith. James the Greater, the first martyred apostle. James the Greater, son of Zebedee and brother of John, emerged from the beginning as a figure of strong temperament. The family owned a small fishing business on the Sea of Galilee, stable enough to employ hired workers, which suggests a slightly higher economic level than that of other disciples. He grew up in an environment of physical labor, sailing in waters as relentless as the political situation in Palestine under Roman rule. His fiery character was reflected in the nickname Jesus gave him along with his brother Boanerges, Sons of Thunder. That nickname was no coincidence. James had a direct and determined spirit, capable of reacting firmly in tense situations. The Gospels repeatedly place him within Jesus' inner circle. He was present at the resurrection of Jairus' daughter, at the transfiguration, and in the agony of Gethsemane. His closeness to the Master was evident, and on several occasions he appears forming a trio together with Peter and John. Despite this privileged position, James does not appear as frequently in long dialogues or specific scenes, which has led scholars to think that his influence within the group was mainly practical, a man of action rather than reflection. One of the most revealing scenes of his personality occurs when his mother, or according to another tradition he himself along with John, asks Jesus to grant them places of honor in the coming kingdom. The request, interpreted by the others as excessive ambition, created tensions within the group. Jesus responded with a phrase that would mark James's destiny. "Can you drink the cup that I am to drink?" Without fully understanding the meaning of the question, the brothers affirmed that they could. Years later, that answer would tragically become reality. After the resurrection, James remained in Jerusalem, taking part in the early community leadership. The Book of Acts mentions him as an active figure alongside John and Peter during the first moments of preaching and confrontation with the Jewish authorities. His specific role is not described in detail, but his constant presence suggests authority and recognition among the first Christians. James's end comes abruptly in Acts 12. It is a key moment in the history of the early church. King Herod, Agrippa I, seeking to win the favor of the Jewish leaders, orders the execution of James by the sword. This expression indicates a beheading, a quick and public method reserved for serious offenses or for prisoners considered politically inconvenient. James's death, around the year AD 44, makes him the first apostle to die as a martyr and one of the few whose death is directly recorded in the Bible. His execution marked the beginning of a more direct persecution of the Christian community in Jerusalem. Peter was arrested immediately afterward, though he miraculously escaped according to the narrative. The death of James left a deep impact on the group, which had to face for the first time the loss of one of its pillars. It was not only the fall of a leader, but the confirmation that the preaching of the gospel placed them squarely in the sights of both political and religious power. From here, Christian tradition developed one of the most influential stories of the Middle Ages, James's preaching in Hispania. No source from the 1st or 2nd century mentions a journey of his to the Iberian Peninsula, but starting in the 7th century, the idea began to spread that he had evangelized regions of the northwest, especially the area of Galicia. According to tradition, after his martyrdom, his disciples carried his body in a boat to the coasts of Galicia, where he was buried in a place that would remain hidden for centuries. In the 9th century, according to the accounts preserved in the Codex Calixtinus, a hermit named Pelayo had visions that indicated the location of his tomb in a forest near what would later become Santiago de Compostela. The discovery coincided with a complex political context. The nascent Hispanic Christendom was seeking symbols to strengthen resistance against the Muslim advance. James became a spiritual and military standard, later acquiring the title of Santiago Matamoros. The tomb quickly attracted pilgrims from all over Europe, giving rise to one of the most important religious movements on the continent, the Camino de Santiago. The figure of the apostle became a bridge between biblical tradition and the cultural identity of medieval Europe. Churches, pilgrim hospitals, and trade routes grew along the paths leading to Compostela, turning the apostle into a symbol of hope, penance, and spiritual renewal. From the 11th century onward, his cult took on a universal dimension. Kings, nobles, peasants, and monks undertook long journeys to venerate his relics. Although many details of this tradition lack historical basis in the earliest centuries of Christianity, its cultural impact is undeniable. The biblical James, silent in scripture yet powerful in his final testimony, merged with the legendary James, protector of pilgrims and symbol of unity in Europe. The paradox of his story is clear. The apostle from whom the fewest words are preserved became the one whose memory generated one of the most important spiritual roots in the world. His early, tragic, and quiet death in Jerusalem contrasts with the monumental devotion his name would inspire more than 7 centuries later. And while James met a sudden end beneath the sword, his spiritual brother Andrew would follow a broader path of mission, one that would lead him to the Greek cities and to a cross of unusual shape. Andrew, the one who brought others to Jesus and died on an X-shaped cross. Andrew, the brother of Peter, appears in the Gospels as a calm and reflective figure, very different from the explosive temperament of his older brother. Both grew up in Bethsaida and worked together as fishermen before settling in Capernaum. However, before meeting Jesus, Andrew had been a disciple of John the Baptist, suggesting a deeper spiritual restlessness than that of most fishermen in the region. His desire to listen to itinerant preachers points to a prior personal search, a yearning to understand the meaning of salvation that permeated the religious atmosphere of the 1st century. The Gospel of John presents him as the first disciple to recognize Jesus as the Messiah after hearing him by the Jordan. His immediate reaction was to seek out his brother Peter and bring him to the Master. That gesture would forever define his role. Andrew is the one who leads others to Jesus. In several episodes, he appears bringing people who seek answers, such as the boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish during the multiplication, or the Greeks who wanted to see Jesus in Jerusalem shortly before Passover. He is not the main speaker nor the impetuous leader, but rather the bridge that facilitates decisive encounters. During Jesus' ministry, Andrew was part of the close group, though not of the inner circle of Peter, James, and John. He was observant, prudent, and able to perceive opportunities where others saw only obstacles. His name, of Greek origin, suggests that his family had a certain cultural openness in a region marked by contact with Hellenized populations. That sensitivity would be key to his later mission. After the resurrection, Andrew remained in Jerusalem for a time, but early sources and later tradition agree that he undertook missions beyond Judea. According to ancient testimonies, he preached in various regions around the Black Sea, Scythia, territories corresponding to modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia, Cappadocia, Bithynia, and Thrace. His name appears linked to communities in Asia Minor and Greece, especially in Byzantium, where he would later be venerated as its spiritual founder. The most widespread account of his preaching places him in Patras, a city in the Peloponnese where he is said to have converted entire groups under Roman rule. There he confronted the authorities directly, for his message attracted influential citizens, among them the wife of a high official named Aegeus. According to tradition, this provoked the magistrate's anger, and he ordered Andrew's arrest and a swift trial for disturbing the religious and political order of the city. The sentence was crucifixion. However, tradition states that Andrew asked not to be crucified on a Latin cross like Jesus because he did not consider himself worthy of imitating his death exactly. The executioners, either following orders or responding to his request, used an X-shaped cross, later known as the Cross of St. Andrew. Unlike typical crucifixions in which victims were nailed, the accounts say that Andrew was tied with ropes to prolong his agony. This form of execution, slower and more painful, allowed the condemned to survive for several days. Hagiographical sources describe that Andrew continued preaching from the cross, urging those present to keep the faith. Although these texts contain devotional elements typical of early Christian literature, they reflect the perception that Andrew maintained extraordinary serenity even in torment. His attitude reportedly moved the local crowds, who attempted to free him, an effort ultimately suppressed by the authorities. Andrew probably died around the year AD 60. His body was buried in Patras, where a place of veneration soon emerged. Centuries later, his relics were transferred to Constantinople by order of Emperor Constantius II in the 4th century, solidifying his role as one of the spiritual protectors of the Eastern Roman Empire. In the 13th century, part of these relics was taken to Amalfi in Italy, where a basilica in his honor is still preserved. The figure of Andrew acquired special symbolism in medieval Europe. In Scotland, the arrival of some of his relics, according to tradition brought by monks from Constantinople, made the apostle its patron saint. The Cross of St. Andrew became a national emblem, appearing even on the modern Scottish flag. This later development demonstrates how a Galilean fisherman ended up influencing the cultural identity of regions located thousands of kilometers from the Mediterranean. Unlike Peter, whose defined leadership placed him at the center of the narratives, Andrew embodies the silent apostleship, the one who does not seek prominence, the one who connects, the one who opens paths. His legacy was built on the ability to recognize in others the potential to approach the faith. His death on a different kind of cross, marked by humility, reinforces this identity. An apostle who lived without notable upheavals, yet whose influence spread across entire continents. His end in Patras, wrapped in prolonged pain but also serenity, prepares the way for another apostle whose story would move from doubt to an unexpected journey toward the far eastern edge of Christian tradition. Thomas, the doubter who ended up dying in India. Thomas, also called Didymus, meaning the twin, appears in the Gospels as one of the disciples with the most complex character. His personality is revealed through brief interventions that show him as thoughtful, serious, and deeply human. Unlike Peter, who was impulsive, or John, who was emotional, Thomas needed proof, clarity, and coherence. He was not unbelieving out of rebellion, but because he resisted accepting extraordinary claims without a concrete basis. In an age dominated by messianic expectation, he seemed to seek a balance between hope and reasoning. The first episode in which he stands out occurs on the way to Bethany, when Jesus decides to return to Judea despite the threats. The disciples fear for his life, but Thomas, with a mixture of courage and resignation, declares, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." The phrase reflects his character, pessimistic, yes, but also profoundly loyal. He was not a charismatic leader, but neither was he a fearful follower. He was a man capable of facing danger with an almost painful honesty. The most famous passage of his story occurs after the resurrection, when the other disciples claim to have seen the risen Master. Thomas was not present at that first appearance and refused to believe without physical evidence. "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, I will not believe." His stance, far from rebellion, represented the reaction of someone who had experienced an abrupt and devastating grief. For him, the crucifixion had been the definitive end, and any claim of victory over death required direct evidence. 8 days later, Jesus appears again among them and shows him his hands and his side. The encounter provokes one of the most forceful confessions in the New Testament: "My Lord and my God." Thomas the skeptic becomes the proclaimer of one of the strongest Christological declarations in biblical literature. His doubt transforms into absolute conviction, not as an act of irrational leap, but as the response to a direct experience that shattered all his internal defenses. After the ascension, Thomas remained for a time in Jerusalem together with the rest of the apostles. However, the oldest and most consistent traditions indicate that his mission unfolded toward the east, much farther than that of any other apostle. Writings such as the Acts of Thomas, an apocryphal text from the 3rd century but based on earlier traditions, place him preaching in regions of Parthia, Persia, and finally in southern India, particularly on the Malabar coast, in what is now the state of Kerala. The Christian communities of India, known as the St. Thomas Christians, have preserved the memory of his arrival for centuries. According to these traditions, Thomas disembarked at the port of Muziris around the year AD 52, a time when the region had active trade with the Roman Empire through maritime routes. This makes the presence of Jewish and Christian travelers in the area historically plausible. There he is said to have preached among merchants, local Jewish communities, and the inhabitants of the southern kingdoms. Tradition holds that he founded 7 Christian communities and that his preaching attracted both devoted followers and influential enemies. In the region of Mylapore near present-day Chennai, he is said to have come into conflict with local religious groups and political authorities. The end of Thomas, according to the accounts, came in the form of a violent martyrdom. He was pierced with spears while praying on a hill, marking his death around the year AD 72. The site where, according to tradition, his martyrdom occurred remains a place of pilgrimage known as the Hill of St. Thomas. His remains, according to ancient sources, were partially moved to Edessa in Mesopotamia in the 3rd century, where his tomb became one of the most important religious centers in the region. Centuries later, relics attributed to the apostle were brought to Ortona in Italy, where they are still venerated. Despite the legendary nature of some accounts, the early expansion of Christianity eastward is solidly documented. The presence of Syriac Christian communities in India since ancient times suggests a direct connection with Aramaic-speaking preachers, which aligns with the figure of Thomas. His story became a symbol of the Christian mission beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire, a journey that crossed completely different seas, cultures, and languages. Thomas, whose name forever became associated with doubt, ended up representing a faith that springs from honest inquiry, from the need to see and understand. And that authenticity defined his legacy. Not blind faith, but one built through profound encounters and radical decisions. His death in Mylapore, far from his homeland, reflects the universal dimension that Christianity adopted in just a few decades. While Thomas took the message to the eastern edge of the known world, other apostles would follow different but equally dangerous routes, including Philip, Bartholomew, and Matthew, whose stories would be intertwined with complex missions and violent ends. Philip, Bartholomew, and Matthew, forgotten missions and bloody ends. Philip, Bartholomew, and Matthew form a trio of apostles whose presence in the Gospels is discreet, almost silent, but whose later traditions describe extensive travels and deaths marked by violence. All 3 are always listed among the 12, but their personalities and destinies emerge mainly from biblical fragments, patristic testimonies, and devotional stories spread between the 2nd and 4th centuries. Philip, originally from Bethsaida, like Peter and Andrew, stands out as one of the first to be called. His character appears rational and direct. It is he who asks Jesus how they will feed the multitude before the multiplication of the loaves, more concerned with logistics than with symbolism. He is also the one who acts as an intermediary when a group of Greeks wants to see Jesus in Jerusalem, indicating that he had some affinity with Hellenized cultures, perhaps due to his Greek name or his contact with mixed communities in Galilee. After the ascension, Tradition places Philip preaching in regions of Syria, Asia Minor, and especially in Hierapolis, a city in Phrygia famous for its hot springs and worship of many deities. According to early Christian sources, Philip succeeded in converting influential groups in the city, triggering the reaction of pagan priests who saw him as a threat. His martyrdom, as narrated in the Acts of Philip, describes him being hung or nailed to a tree, though other versions say he was crucified upside down, while continuing to exhort the crowd. His daughter, described as a prophetess in some stories, is also said to have suffered persecution in the region. While these details have legendary traits, they reflect the hostility toward Christian preachers in areas strongly influenced by polytheism. Bartholomew, traditionally identified with Nathanael, the man without deceit, appears very little in the Gospels, but later tradition makes him one of the apostles who traveled the farthest. According to Armenian, Syrian, and Georgian sources, he preached in Arabia, Mesopotamia, Persia, and especially in Armenia, becoming a foundational figure of Armenian Christianity alongside Jude Thaddeus. The Acts of Bartholomew, although late, agree on his role as a missionary in lands ruled by kings and nobles of diverse religions. The strongest tradition regarding his martyrdom comes from Armenia. There he is said to have angered local religious leaders by converting King Polemius, leading to a revolt led by pagan priests. The torment described is one of the most brutal associated with an apostle. He was flayed alive and then decapitated. His martyrdom, depicted in Christian art with an apostle holding his own skin, became a symbol of extreme fidelity. Despite the dramatic nature typical of Eastern hagiographic literature, the historical core suggests that Bartholomew died as a victim of political and religious tensions in a region where Christianity was beginning to gain influence. His relics quickly scattered. It is said they were transferred to the island of Lipari in Sicily, then to Benevento, and finally to Rome, where a basilica bears his name on Tiber Island. This multiplicity of destinations reflects his devotional importance in the ancient church, especially in the East. Matthew, on the other hand, has a more defined profile in the Gospels. Called Levi in some texts, he was a tax collector in service to the Roman Empire, making him impure and despised among his fellow countrymen. His decision to abandon this position was radical, involving renouncing economic privileges and facing rejection from those who considered him a traitor. According to tradition, Matthew not only preached, but also wrote the gospel that bears his name, primarily aimed at a Jewish audience and filled with references to the law and the prophets. After the events in Jerusalem, various early sources place him preaching in Ethiopia, possibly in what today corresponds to Sudan or Eritrea, Persia, or Mediterranean areas of Africa. The accounts agree that his death was violent. According to Ethiopian traditions, he was murdered while celebrating Mass, attacked by soldiers sent by a local ruler hostile to the spread of Christianity. Other versions claim he was pierced by a sword or a spear in an episode that reflects the dangerous environment in which the early Christian missions took place. The case of Matthew illustrates an interesting dimension: the contrast between his past as a collaborator in the Roman tax system and his end as a victim of foreign authorities who saw Christianity as a threat to their power structures. His figure appears as a bridge between two worlds, the imperial world and the Jewish Christian message, and his death confirms that his decision to follow Jesus led him to territories and conflicts he would never have faced behind a tax collector's desk. And while these three apostles carried the message through diverse and turbulent routes, two others, Simon the Zealot and Jude Thaddeus, traveled paths even more shrouded in silence and legend, extending their missions to the far eastern reaches of the Persian Empire. Simon the Zealot and Judas Thaddeus, apostles between silence and legend. Simon the Zealot and Judas Thaddeus, also called Lebbaeus or simply Thaddeus, are two of the most enigmatic apostles. Their names appear in all the lists of the New Testament, but the silence of the Gospels regarding their personalities, occupations, and participation during Jesus' ministry has given rise to a wide variety of traditions. The little that is historically known is intertwined with stories passed down over centuries in communities of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Persia, places where both are believed to have preached and died. Simon is given the title Zealot, a term that can have multiple meanings. In the 1st century, a zealot could refer to a nationalist and violent movement seeking to expel the Romans from Palestine. It could also simply designate someone zealous for the law, deeply observant, without direct political involvement. Whether Simon belonged to the radical group or not, his presence among the 12 reveals a notable contrast. Jesus gathered in the same circle a possible insurgent and a tax collector like Matthew, natural enemies in the society of their time. If the term refers more to his religious fervor, then he was a passionate man, austere and probably committed to Jewish identity. In either case, Simon represents the ideological diversity within the apostolic group. Judas Thaddeus, on the other hand, appears in the Gospels as one of the disciples who intervenes at the Last Supper, asking why Jesus would reveal himself to the disciples and not to the world. This brief dialogue suggests a practical man seeking to understand the scope of the message. Early tradition affirms that Judas was a relative of Jesus, the son of Alphaeus or Clopas, and the brother of James the Less, which connects him to the Master's family. This would explain why, in the early church, the figure of Thaddeus became associated with the Jewish Christian community of Jerusalem before embarking on his mission to the east. After the resurrection, both Simon and Thaddeus disappear from the biblical accounts but emerge strongly in the traditions of Eastern evangelization. Various Syrian, Armenian, and Persian sources hold that both traveled together to Mesopotamia, preaching in regions that today correspond to Iraq, Iran, and Syria. The mission in the kingdom of Edessa, an important city in northern Mesopotamia, is attributed to Thaddeus. There, he is said to have evangelized King Abgar V, according to a story known as the Correspondence of Abgar, which has been circulated since the 2nd century. Although the historicity of this episode is highly debated, it shows how Thaddeus's figure acquired a central role in the identity of the churches in Syria. Simon the Zealot appears in traditions linked to Egypt, Libya, and especially Persia. Some accounts state that he first preached in Egypt, then in Cyrenaica, and finally joined Thaddeus to evangelize in Persian territory. There, according to these sources, both faced fierce opposition from Zoroastrian priests and local leaders who saw Christianity as a threat to their cults. The martyrdom of Simon and Thaddeus is often placed in the Persian city of Suania or Arbat. Although the locations vary between Armenian and Syrian traditions, the most widespread versions agree that they were executed together. In one, they were brutally beaten with hammers until they died. In another, they were sawed in half or pierced with spears. One of the most symbolic depictions shows Thaddeus with a halberd, a weapon associated with his martyrdom, and Simon with a saw, alluding to the violence at the end they suffered. The Armenian accounts, particularly rich in detail, describe that their preaching had a profound impact in some regions, leading to conversions among noble families and violent reactions in pagan temples. Armenia would become the first Christian kingdom in the world in 301 AD, and the veneration of Thaddeus and Bartholomew as the spiritual founders of the Armenian faith was consolidated throughout the Middle Ages. The historical existence of churches and monasteries attributed to these apostles reinforces the influence of their traditions in Asia Minor and the Caucasus. From the 4th century onward, their relics began to spread. Part of the remains attributed to Thaddeus are venerated in the Iranian city of Gara Kalisa, the Black Church, one of the oldest Christian temples in the world. Simon, according to various medieval sources, is said to have relics scattered between Rome, Toulouse, and Cologne, reflecting the devotion both apostles received in both the East and the West. The legendary nature of many of these stories does not erase the historical backdrop. Early Christians faced severe persecutions in territories where local beliefs were closely tied to political structures. Preaching a message that challenged the authority of priests and rulers entailed a constant risk. In this sense, the violent death of Simon and Thaddeus, although embellished with literary elements, reflects the real hostility that early Christianity encountered along eastern routes. The two apostles, almost invisible in the Gospels, became pillars of communities that survived Persian invasions, Roman wars, and centuries of isolation. Their figures embody the silent side of the apostolate: long missions, remote territories, fierce persecutions, and a legacy hidden beneath layers of tradition. And while Simon and Thaddeus were lost among the mountains and deserts of Persia, another apostle took a very different path, one marked by betrayal, guilt, and an end that shook the ancient world. Zealots, the radical Jewish group that fought against Rome through selective assassinations. Although this association is debated, it reflects the politically charged atmosphere in which Judas lived. Beyond his exact origins, Judas appears in the Gospels as the keeper of the common purse, responsible for managing the group's resources. Judas Iscariot, the traitor and his chilling end. Judas Iscariot is undoubtedly the most controversial and enigmatic figure among the 12 apostles. His name became synonymous with betrayal, but the man behind the stigma is lost in fragments of biblical texts, ancient interpretations, and theories that have emerged over the centuries. While the other apostles are remembered for their preaching and martyrdom, Judas was forever marked by a single act that changed the course of Christian history. The origin of his surname, Iscariot, is one of the first mysteries. One possible interpretation is that it comes from the Hebrew Ish-Keriot, man of Keriot, which would make Judas the only apostle from the southern region of Judea, far from the dominant Galilean circle. Another theory connects it to the term Sicarii, a radical group of Jewish assassins which, if true, would add a darker dimension to his background. Judas's character is difficult to define precisely. In some episodes, he appears as a critic of financial decisions, especially in the scene where Mary anoints Jesus' feet with costly perfume. John asserts that his objection was hypocritical and that he was stealing from the common purse, although this view may reflect a later theological interpretation rather than a verifiable fact. What is certain is that Judas was deeply involved in the life of the group, and his subsequent betrayal was not the act of an outsider, but that of someone who had closely lived alongside Jesus and the others. The motivation behind the betrayal has been a subject of debate since the earliest centuries. The Gospel of Matthew speaks of greed. Judas went to the chief priests and asked how much they would give him to hand over Jesus. 30 pieces of silver was the agreed amount, a symbolic figure associated in the book of Zechariah with the price of a despised slave. However, other scholars have suggested political motivations. Perhaps Judas expected Jesus to assume a more explicit and nationalist messianic role, and when he saw his master speaking of death and service, he decided to break with him. Whatever the reason, the result was devastating. The scene in the Garden of Gethsemane is one of the most dramatic moments in the biblical narrative. Judas leads the temple guards to Jesus, using a kiss as a sign. That gesture, filled with symbolism, is remembered as the most intimate betrayal possible, a sign of friendship turned into a weapon. The soldiers arrest Jesus while his disciples flee, and Judas is forever marked as the one responsible for initiating the path to the crucifixion. Judas's repentance appears strongly in the Gospel of Matthew. After seeing that Jesus had been condemned, he returned the 30 pieces of silver and confessed that he had handed over innocent blood. The priests refused his money, and in despair he threw the coins into the temple. Then he took his own life by hanging himself. This account presents Judas as a man consumed by guilt, unable to bear the weight of his actions. The Book of Acts, however, offers a different version of his end. It says that Judas purchased a field with the money from his betrayal and fell headlong, bursting open in the middle, in an abrupt and violent death. This grotesque image may have arisen from a different tradition, or an attempt to emphasize the moral gravity of his act. Both versions agree that his death was directly linked to the betrayal and was seen as a tragic and irreversible end. The place of his death is known in tradition as Hakeldama, Field of Blood, located south of Jerusalem. According to the accounts, a plot of land was bought with the money Judas returned, and the site became a reminder of the fate of the one who handed over the master. The contrast between his earlier life, in which he followed Jesus, managed the purse, and was part of the inner circle, and his abrupt end, filled with horror and loneliness, became a powerful warning in Christian tradition. From the 1st century onward, Judas's figure began to be interpreted in multiple ways. In apocryphal literature, texts emerged attempting to explain his motivations, some even presenting him as an involuntary instrument of the divine plan. The Gospel of Judas, discovered in the 20th century in its Coptic form, proposes that the betrayal was an act ordered by Jesus himself. However, this Gnostic interpretation was never accepted by Christian tradition. Nevertheless, it shows that the figure of Judas continued to generate questions, doubts, and controversies. In art and popular devotion, Judas was portrayed as the archetype of the traitor, but also as a symbol of the danger of absolute despair. His story is a reminder of the complexity of human nature, a close disciple, capable of noble acts and devastating decisions. His death reveals the shadow that accompanied the birth of Christianity, a shadow that coexisted with the heroic mission of the other apostles. While Judas found a heartbreaking end marked by guilt and violence, the story of the apostles moved toward another challenge. What parts of their lives can be considered historical and which were born from the fervor and imagination of the early Christian communities? The difference between the historical and the legendary. Talking about the 12 apostles means stepping into a realm where documented history and devotional tradition intertwine almost inseparably. The Gospels, written between the years 60 and 100 AD, are the primary source for knowing their names and their closeness to Jesus, but they are not designed as exhaustive biographies. Their purpose is theological, not chronological. Therefore, the lives of the apostles after the ascension are reconstructed from fragments of the book of Acts, letters from the New Testament, testimonies of early Christian authors, and a vast collection of traditions, many of which emerged between the 2nd and 4th centuries. The central question is inevitable: what can be considered historically solid, and what belongs to the realm of faith, popular tradition, or hagiographic literature? What is historically reliable begins with the real existence of the 12. The names of Peter, Andrew, James, and John appear in all the lists of the New Testament and in multiple independent sources confirming their historicity. It is also historically accepted that Peter led the early Christian community, that John played a significant role, and that James the Greater was executed by Herod Agrippa I around 44 AD, a fact directly documented in Acts 12. The preaching of Thomas in the East, though not fully verifiable, coincides with the historical existence of very ancient Syriac communities in India, which suggests a real core behind the tradition. On the other hand, many aspects of their martyrdoms are preserved only in later sources. Peter's crucifixion upside down is mentioned by Origen and later by Jerome, authors from the 3rd and 4th centuries, respectively. There is no contemporary document to confirm it, though the consistency of the Roman tradition makes it plausible. The same is true for John. It is historically plausible that he died in Ephesus, but the detail that he was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and survived, as told by Tertullian, clearly belongs to the genre of devotional miracles. The martyrdom of Andrew in Patras, nailed to a cross in the shape of an X, comes from the Acts of Andrew, an apocryphal text from the 2nd or 3rd century filled with moral symbolism. While the Greek tradition widely accepted this, the lack of historical corroboration makes it difficult to distinguish between the facts and literary construction. A similar situation occurs with Bartholomew. The brutal image of his flaying comes from Armenian and Syrian traditions that seek to emphasize his bravery, but it cannot be verified through contemporary sources. His presence in Armenia is plausible, but the specific detail of his torment comes from the dramatic style of Eastern hagiography. As for Matthew, his violent death is accepted by most traditions, but the accounts radically differ. Some speak of his assassination in Ethiopia, others in Syria or Persia. The contradictions reveal that his martyrdom was transmitted orally for centuries before being fixed in written texts. Simon the Zealot and Judas Thaddeus represent another example of historical fragmentation. Their missions in Persia and Mesopotamia are supported by very ancient traditions, but the type of torture they suffered varies according to the region that preserves the account. The only certainty is that their memory became associated with Eastern evangelization. Judas Iscariot represents a different case. His existence and his betrayal are documented in all early Christian traditions, confirming his historical role. However, his death was narrated in two distinct ways, by hanging in Matthew and by a fatal fall in Acts. These differences cannot be fully reconciled and show that even such a central episode was interpreted in diverse ways in the early communities. The apocryphal texts are a fundamental part of the popular image of the apostles. Writings such as the Acts of Peter, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Acts of Thomas, and the Acts of Andrew were composed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to strengthen the identity of local communities. They employed a dramatic literary style, full of prodigies and lengthy speeches, more akin to moralizing theatre than historical chronicle. These works were highly influential, shaping medieval iconography and expanding details that today are repeated as if they were documented facts. In parallel, archaeology offers a more solid counterpoint. The tomb venerated as that of Peter beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the tomb of John in Ephesus, the Armenian basilica dedicated to Thaddeus, and the early remains of Christian communities in India reveal that, while the exact accounts may be wrapped in legends, The apostolic presence in these regions left tangible traces. The blend of history and devotion is evident. Cult structures built on locations whose original identification may have been precise or may have evolved from the faith of the community. Oral transmission also played a crucial role. During the early centuries, the stories of the apostles circulated among scattered communities facing persecution. Local traditions blended with family memories, travelers' accounts, and theological motivations. When they were eventually written down, many had acquired symbolic elements meant to strengthen faith, not to document minute details. The distinction between the historical and the legendary is not intended to discredit the traditions, but to understand their nature. The chains of transmission reveal what each community valued: courage, faithfulness, and perseverance in the face of persecution. The details of the martyrdoms may vary, but the core is consistent. Almost all died violently for their faith, far from their homes and in lands where their message provoked deep tensions. This balance between history and legend illuminates the harshness of the context in which the apostles lived, a time when preaching the gospel could cost one's life. And this reality paves the way for a broader chapter, where the world around them would emerge as a hostile, relentless stage, decisive for their destinies. The world against them, persecution, the Roman Empire, and blood. The story of the apostles cannot be understood without directly facing the world they encountered. After the death and resurrection of Jesus, those 12 men, mostly young, without academic training or political protection, dispersed throughout a vast empire that was complex and deeply hostile to anything that threatened its religious and social equilibrium. The Roman Empire, despite its relative tolerance towards foreign cults, required one fundamental principle: that no new religion undermine the authority of the state, especially the public veneration of the emperor. The apostles preached precisely the opposite: a lord above Caesar, a kingdom above imperial power. That tension marked their lives and decisively their deaths. The Roman Empire of the 1st century combined military stability with a deeply ingrained religious system. The Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, was maintained through public rituals aimed at securing divine protection over the state. Any movement that disturbed this balance was seen as dangerous. Christians, by refusing to participate in these rituals and offer sacrifices to the emperor, were considered not only heretics but potential enemies of public order. The apostles, as leaders of this emerging movement, embodied, for many local authorities, an immediate threat. The first persecutions were local, driven by tensions between Jewish and Nazarene communities. The Book of Acts describes how Peter and John were arrested in Jerusalem, how Stephen, one of the first deacons, was stoned, and how James the Greater was executed by order of Herod Agrippa I. These actions reflect the concerns of Jewish authorities about a movement that reinterpreted the law and proclaimed the crucified Messiah as Lord. The apostles in this context moved between synagogues, public squares, and private homes under constant risk. As Christianity spread beyond Judea, the conflict took on an imperial dimension. Rome did not persecute Christians for their theology, but for their refusal to participate in state cults. In cities like Ephesus, Corinth, Antioch, and even Rome itself, Christian preachers clashed with economies built on pagan temples and sanctuaries. The episode of Paul in Ephesus, although he was not one of the 12 apostles, serves as an example of this context and illustrates how evangelization could put artisans who made idols in crisis. In these types of tensions, Peter, John, Philip, and the others moved. The apostles also faced a world marked by migrations, dangerous trade routes, and territories dominated by alternative powers. According to tradition, Thomas preached in kingdoms outside of Rome, such as Parthia and the principalities of India, where his message clashed with the authority of Brahmin priests and local rulers. Bartholomew in Armenia is said to have been a victim of the violent resistance of pagan priests who saw the conversion of nobles as a threat to their own power. Simon and Thaddeus in Persia confronted the Zoroastrian religious structure, one of the oldest and most rigid in the ancient world. The deaths of the apostles were a direct consequence of these tensions. Peter and Paul died in Rome during Nero's persecution around 64 AD, when the emperor sought scapegoats for the city's fire. Although not all accounts are precise, Roman tradition is consistent. Peter was crucified, and Paul was beheaded due to his status as a citizen. Andrew died in Patras under local Greek authorities, Philip in Hierapolis, Bartholomew in Armenia, Matthew in African or Syrian lands, James the Greater under a Jewish king allied with Rome, Simon and Thaddeus in Persia, Thomas by spears in India. John was the only one who died of old age, though he had previously suffered exile in Patmos. The common denominator is clear: all except for John faced violent deaths. And this violence was not the result of chance, but of the direct clash between a message proclaiming spiritual freedom and a political religious system demanding absolute adherence. The apostles preached the existence of a single true God who did not dwell in temples made by human hands, and announced a community where there was no distinction between slave and free, between Greek and Jew. For Rome, these ideas represented a dangerous rift. Roman literature from the 1st and 2nd centuries confirms the negative perception of Christians. Tacitus calls them a destructive superstition. Suetonius refers to them as people given to disorder. Pliny the Younger, in a letter to Emperor Trajan, admits that he doesn't know how to deal with them, but acknowledges that their influence was spreading even among people of high social standing. This cultural climate explains why the apostles, as they traveled from city to city, were exposed to arrests, torture, and public hostility. However, martyrdom did not stop the expansion of the movement. On the contrary, the stories of the apostles dying for their faith became symbols of resistance. Communities preserved tales of bravery as expressions of identity and hope. Although many details were embellished over time, the historical core remains. The apostles faced a world that saw their message as a threat. The presence of the apostles in territories as far-reaching as Rome, Armenia, Persia, or India testifies to the speed with which Christianity spread, but also to the magnitude of the danger they faced. Their lives were a constant crossroads marked by political, religious, and cultural tensions. The legacy of the apostles in the church and history. The impact of the 12 apostles extended far beyond their brief and turbulent lives. What began as a small group of disciples following a wandering teacher transformed within a few decades into a network of communities scattered across the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and, according to tradition, even India. None of them lived long enough to witness the historical magnitude of their mission, but the legacy they left shaped the identity of the church, inspired entire religious movements, and established pilgrimage routes that remain active to this day. Their memory became a cornerstone of Christian history and a bridge between the ancient world and the faith that continued to expand over the centuries. The first element of the apostolic legacy was the structure of the church itself. Christian communities, initially fragmented and meeting in private homes, recognized the authority of those who had lived directly with Jesus. Peter, John, James the Less, and the others became figures whose oral teachings and pastoral leadership guided the early doctrinal and organizational decisions. Over time, those who received their mission, the bishops and presbyters, began to be seen as their successors, transmitting apostolic teaching to new generations. From this emerged the notion of apostolic succession, a concept that remained vital in both the Catholic and Orthodox churches, defining the spiritual lineage of Christian leaders. Another fundamental aspect of the apostolic legacy was the formation of the New Testament canon. While the apostles did not write all the texts traditionally attributed to them, such as the Gospels, their teachings and memories directly influenced their content. The Gospel according to Matthew reflects the perspective of a community linked to an apostle. That of John comes from a circle closely associated with him. The letters of Peter and John include instructions attributed to them, and the oral preaching going back to Peter and other disciples became the foundation of the document we now know as the Gospel of Mark. Without the apostles, the historical memory of Jesus would have remained scattered. With them, it became a corpus that would serve as the foundation of the Christian faith. The veneration of their tombs, relics, and places associated with their preaching constitutes another important dimension of the apostolic legacy. From the early centuries, Christians gathered around the graves of martyrs like Peter in Rome, John in Ephesus, or James in Jerusalem. These sites became centers of prayer and later pilgrimage destinations. Peter's tomb, located beneath the current St. Peter's Basilica, became one of the holiest sites in Christendom. John's tomb in Ephesus gave rise to a devotional tradition that endured even under Byzantine and Ottoman rule. Thomas's tomb, venerated in Mylapore, modern-day Chennai, became one of the oldest Eastern churches in the world. The case of James the Greater exemplifies better than any other the cultural dimension of the apostolic legacy. The tradition of his journey to Hispania, although historically debated, gave rise to the Camino de Santiago, one of the most important pilgrimage routes in medieval Europe. Since the 9th century, millions of people have walked toward Compostela seeking redemption, spiritual strength, or simply the experience of crossing entire kingdoms following the trail of an apostle. Its symbolism united diverse peoples, inspired monumental architectural works, strengthened European Christian identity, and transformed northern Spain into a historical cultural crossroads. The legacy of Andrew had a special impact on Eastern Christianity. His figure was adopted as the protector of the Byzantine Empire, and Constantinople considered him its first spiritual bishop. Later, Scotland chose him as its patron saint, integrating the cross of St. Andrew into its national flag. Thomas left his mark on Syriac Christianity and the communities in India, where his memory remains alive to this day in churches that claim direct descent from his mission. Bartholomew and Thaddeus became pillars of Armenian tradition, deeply linked to their martyrdoms and to the spiritual foundation of the country.